Good day, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in philosophy. This is part of my lectures in modern philosophy, and in this lecture I will be focusing on the philosophy of Nicholas Malebranche. Nicholas Malebranche is a French Catholic theologian and is the most important Cartesian philosopher of the second half of the 17th century. His philosophical system was a grand synthesis of the thought of his two intellectual mentors, namely St. Augustine and René Descartes. His life and works. Nicolas de Malebranche was born in Paris in 1638. Like Descartes and Pascal, Malebranche was born in frail health, and he had severe malformation of the spine and weak lungs. Because of these conditions, he needed to be tutored at home until the age of 16. He studied philosophy at the Collège de la Marche, and after graduating, he went to study theology at the Sorbonne. His education left him with a dislike of scholasticism that focused on the work of Aristotle. Therefore, in 1660, he decided to leave the universities and entered the Oratory, a religious congregation founded in Paris in 1611 by the Augustinian theologian Pierre Bérulle. At the Oratory, Malebranche studied ecclesiastical history, linguistics, and the Bible, and he came under the influence of the works of St. Augustine. But his enthusiasm for Descartes was stronger, and he became an admirer of the father of modern philosophy. He was ordained priest on September 14, 1664. Malebranche's philosophical reputation rests mainly on his three important doctrines. First is occasionalism. Second, his notion of vision in God. And third, his theodicy. Occasionalism is most systematic and famous position or doctrine. It is a theory of causation according to which God is the only genuine causal agent in the universe. It means that all physical and mental events in nature are merely occasions for God to exercise his necessarily efficacious power. Vision in God. Malebranche argues that the representational ideas, meaning those ideas in our mind that function in human knowledge and perception, are in fact the ideas in God's understanding, meaning these are ideas in God's mind, the eternal archetypes or essences of things. Theodicy. In Theodicy, Malebranche justifies God's ways and explains the existence of evil and sin in the world by appealing to the simplicity and universality of the laws of nature and grace that God has established and is compelled to follow. All the three doctrines. In these doctrines, Malebranche's overwhelming concern is to demonstrate the essential and active role of God in every aspect of the universe, be it the material, the cognitive, and moral. Malebranche read Descartes' Treatise on Man, which provides a sketch of a mechanistic account of the psychology or physiology of the human body. He was so enthusiastic after reading the treatise that Malebranche decided to study this treatise. So he devoted himself to a decade-long study of the Cartesian method and its results in mathematics and natural philosophy. The principal fruit of that study was a two-volume work with the title The Search After Truth, Recherche de la Vérité, first published in 1674 to 1675. So this is the cover of that book, The Search After Truth. One of the most important work of Malebranche. So, what do we find in the search after truth in that book? The search after truth, the book, treated the nature of the human mind and the use that must be made of it to avoid error in the sciences. This work provides the basis for Malebranche's reputation in the early modern period. It is a wide-ranging opus that covers various topics in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, physics, the physiology of cognition, and philosophical theology. It was both admired and criticized by many of his contemporaries, especially the most celebrated thinkers of his time, including Leibniz, Arnold, and Locke, and was the focus of several fierce and time-consuming public debates. The researcher, or the search after truth, focuses on the principal sources of human error and on the method for avoiding those errors and finding the truth. The first volume of the researcher, the first three books, was published in 1674 and drew an immediate response in 1675 from Simon Foscher, the canon of Saint Chapelle of Dijon. Foscher, an academic skeptic, attacked the assumption that ideas in one can represent these objects distinct from oneself. Robert de Gabet, a Cartesian Benedictine, replied to Foscher by insisting that the Cartesian rule that clear and distinct ideas are true presupposes that one's thoughts corresponds to real external objects. However, Malebranche refuted both thinkers for failing to read the book they were discussing, noting that in particular that he had explicitly argued in the Recherche that ideas that one perceives exist in God himself rather than in oneself. Therefore, the ideas are not found in man's mind, but they exist in the mind of God. So, these are the books or parts of the search after truth. The first five books enumerate the various errors deriving from the senses, the nature of imagination, pure understanding, inclination, and passion. The sixth and the last discusses the method, specifically the ways to preserve the evidence in the search for truth. Book 1 discusses and enumerates the errors of the senses. Book 2 discusses the imagination in general. Book 3 is about understanding or pure intellect. And the main topic of the third book is pure understanding, which is a defense of the claim that the ideas through which one perceives bodies exist in God. So that's the vision in God. Book 4 discusses the inclinations of the spirit. Book 5 is devoted to the nature and origin of the passions. And finally, the sixth book is devoted to the Cartesian method of avoiding such errors through attention to clear and distinct ideas. So, in this sixth and last book, contained a critique of the most dangerous error of the ancients, namely the Aristotelian position that there are secondary causes in nature distinct from God, meaning there is no secondary causes that are distinct from God. Now, there are some objections that were raised against the researcher. First, his claim that reason does not yield a demonstrative argument for the existence of the material world. His doctrine of the vision of ideas in God, or the vision in God. His conclusion that one knows one's soul through a confused consciousness rather than through a clear idea of its nature. And his occasionalist thesis that God is the only true cause of everything in the universe. In 1678, Malebranche appended to the Search After Truth 16 clarifications that respond to these objections, to the objections previously raised against the book. Now, the other works of Malebranche: Treatise on Nature and Grace, published in 1680, which contains his theory of divine action, meaning that ideas are representative beings distinct from one's perceptions. Here, he discusses the necessity of the general laws of grace and nature. Next is Christian Conversations, published in 1677, which presents a defense of the Christian religion that emphasizes one's dependence on God for knowledge and happiness. Christian and Metaphysical Meditations, 1683. It offers a summary of Malebranche's system that highlights the central role that God plays in both metaphysics and morality. It is actually a follow-up to his work entitled Conversations. Then, Treatise on Ethics, 1684, where he developed his views in moral philosophy. He argues that moral virtue requires a love of the immutable order that God reveals to those who seek to know it. Then you have Dialogues on Metaphysics and on Religion, published in 1688. It is a concise summary of his main metaphysical doctrines of the vision in God and occasionalism, and also addresses the problem of evil. Next is Laws of the Communication of Motions, published in 1692. It is a short study on Descartes' law of the conservation of the quantity of motion, but offers different rules governing collisions that has no appeal to a force in bodies to remain at rest as Descartes presented. In correspondence with Malebranche, Leibniz emphasized difficulties with Descartes' conservation law, and that correspondence led Malebranche to insert into a 1700 edition of the laws the claim that experience reveals the falsity of this law. Arnold argued that ideas are simply aspects of the perceptual modifications of one's soul. After a further exchange on the topic of the nature of ideas, the debate between Arnold and Malebranche turned to the religious issues of divine providence, grace, and miracles. And the battle, or the exchange, the heated exchange, became increasingly bitter, and as a result of a campaign on the part of Arnold and his supporters. Malebranche's nature was put on the Catholic Index of Prohibited Books in 1690, and the Recherche was added in 1709. So the Malebranche-Arnold polemic continued even after Arnold's death in 1694, with the posthumous publication of two letters from Arnold in 1699, and of Malebranche's response to these letters in 1704. Now, let's go to his theory of knowledge, ideas, and the vision in God. Malebranche's philosophical system is fundamentally Augustinian, and it was inspired by philosophy of Descartes. Descartes' philosophy appealed to him because of the scientific and mathematical discoveries he found there, and because of its own Augustinian nature. Malebranche, trying to be as faithful as possible to St. Augustine's thought, as he tried to incorporate into his doctrine the important metaphysical and epistemological insights of the new mechanistic science. This is particularly evident in his theory of ideas and account of human knowledge. Most philosophers of the 17th century agree that perception and knowledge is mediated by immaterial representations that are immediately present to the mind. Descartes generally called them ideas. This is an example of representationalism. Ideas are representations in the mind of physical external reality. So you have reality, you perceive reality, and as you perceive reality, you form ideas in the mind. So these ideas are representations of reality. These ideas equals knowledge. So when you have ideas in the mind, therefore you have knowledge. But ideas are representations of reality. Now, there was much disagreement, however, over the origin and the ontological status of these ideas. So questions like, how do ideas become present to the mind? So how do we form them? How do they enter our mind? Next, are ideas modifications of the mind? Or they are the exact copies of reality? Meaning, as the mind copy them, does the mind modify the ideas? Or they are exact copies of reality? And third, are they acts of the mind or the objects of perception? So Malebranche's doctrine of the vision in God was the most unorthodox and controversial theory of ideas in the period. And it tries to explain or answer the previously posed questions. It is based on the Christian, Platonic, and Augustinian model, according to which the ideas, are archetypes or essences, and which in the divine understanding, meaning the ideas are exemplary ideas. Okay? So there are exemplary ideas in the mind of God. Now, human beings have access to these ideas. We can have access to these ideas in the mind of God. And this serves as the ground of all eternal truth. So, following the idea or the notion of divine illumination, Malebranche opined that through a process of continuous illumination, our mind is informed of these exemplary ideas. Okay? So human beings are informed, their cognitive powers are informed of these exemplary ideas which are present in the mind of God through a process of illumination or the light coming from God. Now, what are the attributes of this idea, of these exemplary ideas or essences in the mind of God? They are necessary and immutable. And therefore, they cannot come from sense knowledge, because sense knowledge is contingent and mutable. They cannot come from the intellect, because the intellect is also contingent. Therefore, it must come from a higher power that can produce an idea more than to create material things. And this power to create these ideas or to produce this idea certainly does not belong to man. Therefore, these ideas that are eternal and necessary, they come from God, or they are in God. That's why we have the visions of this idea in God, the vision in God. So it is in God that we see these ideas. His famous doctrine of this vision in God. We see external objects by means of ideas that are in the mind of God. So Malebranche claims that everyone agrees that we do not perceive objects external to us by themselves, since it can hardly be the case that the soul should leave the body and stroll about the heavens to see the objects that are present there. So it must really have come from something. It must have come from God. So this theory of vision in God is based on the following. First, the problem of error that arises when we base our judgment on senses and imagination. Many philosophers agree, especially the rationalist philosophers, that the senses and imaginations are the cause of our errors in knowledge. Next, on the basic dualist framework of Cartesian ontology, meaning the duality between mind and body. Descartes posited that there are two substances, the res cogitans and the res extensa. So, according to Malebranche, the problem of error that arises when we base our judgment on the testimony of the senses and the imagination happens rather than on reasoning and understanding. So the cause of our error is the imagination and the senses, not reasoning and understanding. The senses and the imagination lead us into error, and therefore we must not allow their images to serve as basis for judgment about the truth of things. So we should only rely on the testimony of reason, and the perfect evidence of clear and distinct ideas are found in reason. We find in reason the clear and distinct ideas. So it follows that sense knowledge does not have any great value at all. We have a clear and distinct ideas of extension insofar as it is apprehended in God. But this does not assure us of the real existence of the external world, and therefore we have but a confused idea of the material or external world. All knowledge, therefore, is restricted to the ideas which are seen in God. Again, vision in God. So Malebranche's theory of knowledge is based on this dualistic framework of Cartesian ontology. And in Cartesian ontology, there are two substances, the res cogitans and the res extensa. And Malebranche based his theory of knowledge on this Cartesian ontology. First, the mind, or the thinking substance, is unextended. It is thought. And it has absolutely nothing in common with matter. Matter defined as extension. A material body, or matter, has only the mathematical, meaning objective properties of shape, size, visibility, and mobility. All the other sensible qualities, like for example, color, heat, cold, taste, odor, and so on, are really only sensations in the mind. They are regarded as mental modifications occasioned by external material objects. So, while the mathematical properties are objective, the sensible qualities are subjective qualities. Now, the four functions of sensations. First, to indicate the presence of bodies to our own body, but it cannot provide us clear and distinct knowledge of these bodies. So it indicates the presence of the bodies, but it does not give us clear knowledge of these bodies. It only informs us of what is presently taking place in our own minds. But it does not have any representational value with respect to the external world. Meaning it cannot even represent the external world. Now, for example, the heat that one feels when one is near a fire is simply an obscure sensation that reveals nothing but the nature of fire itself as an extended reality. But it does not tell us about the nature of fire. So it simply tells us that there is a fire beside or near us. That's why we feel the sensation of heat. Now, what about ideas? Unlike qualitative sensations, we have a clear and distinct, the ideas have a clear and distinct representational content, meaning they can represent objects, but of course generally of a quantitative nature. Ideas provides us with an ambiguous and complete knowledge about objects and their properties, unlike the sensation, which can only tell us about the presence of these properties, but it cannot tell us about the nature of these objects. So, for example, the idea of the square presents with perfect evidence all the information needed for full knowledge of the geometric properties of squares. So if we have the idea of what a square is, then all the information needed by the mind to understand what a square is already there. Right? But if you see, for example, an object that has a shape of a square, like for example a table, then the table will only tell us about, or the image of the table will only tell us about that there is something near us, an object there near us. But our sensation of the table will never tell us about the nature of the table. So, for Malebranche, ideas are pure concepts, and their content has no sensory component whatsoever. They are just the logical essences of things or kinds. This epistemological distinction between ideas and sensations derives from Descartes' distinction between clear and distinct ideas and the obscure and confused ideas. So the clear and confused ideas come from our sense, our reason, from our mind, while the confused and obscure ideas comes from our sensation. So ideas and sensations are epistemologically and ontologically different. While sensations are mental, ideas are not. Representative ideas are present to the mind, not as modifications of the mind's substance. Their presence is what allows them to represent extended beings to the mind. Ideas are in God. Okay? So our sensations are in our mind, but ideas are not in our mind. Ideas are in the mind of God. However, our mind, our finite mind, have access to them because God wills to reveal them to these finite minds, all of which exist in a perpetual union with God. So our mind may not have the ideas because the ideas are in the mind of God, but because we are perpetually united with God, our mind is illumined by God, and therefore we have access to these ideas. So, the ideas that function in human perception and knowledge are simply the ideas, meaning the eternal essences or exemplars or archetypes in the divine understanding. So, we see all things in the mind of God. And what allows it, or what allows the mind to see this in God, is that we are perpetually united to the divine mind through illumination. So here he follows in the Gaussian idea that what we see in God are eternal and immutable truth. Truth is, by its nature, changeless, universal, and uncreated. So truth is higher than and common to many minds. Hence, it can be nowhere but in the divine reason, meaning in God Himself. So ideas do not belong to the mind, since ideas are infinite and the mind is finite. And it is impossible for a finite mind to have an infinite modification. Our ideas are all general. They only become particular or specific when combined with some sensory components. For example, a particular substance, such as the mind, cannot have a modification that is general. So we have ideas, for example, of square, then it becomes particular if we combine this idea of square with some sensory components. For example, square object, square book, square house. So it becomes particular and specific because it is combined with something that is which can be perceived or sensed by our senses. So ideas function in all of the mind's cognitive activities, in conception and in perception. In conception, the mind apprehends a pure idea by itself, without any sensations to particularize the experience. Like, for example, conceiving a geometric circle or a square. In perception, however, ideas are present in the mind but are accompanied or combined by various sensory elements. Like when we perceive the sun, there is the pure idea of the circle, but it is accompanied by the color yellow and by other sensations like the heat. That's why the ideas are present in our perception. Now, let's go to his metaphysics. Malebranche proves the existence of God through the ontological argument of St. Augustine and Descartes. Our intuition of ideas that exist in the mind of God and the sense of His presence in our souls are proofs of God's existence. God's attributes include His being the creator of spirit and of matter. So He is the creator of the spiritual substance and the material substance. Non-causality between spirit and matter and vice versa. So there's no cause-effect relation between spirit and matter. The spirit does not affect matter, and matter does not affect the spirit. The soul, as a spirit, cannot act upon the body, nor can the body act upon the soul. The only cause of the interaction or the causality between matter and spirit is God. It is God who produces all effects, whether those effects are in matter or in spirit. Created beings, like men, are not secondary causes, as scholasticism teaches, but simple occasions for the direct intervention of God. This is now his occasionalism, his idea of occasionalism. The created beings, they provide occasions for God to intervene or to act. So Malebranche admits the plurality of substances, but he agrees with Spinoza that in teaching that there is only one cause. So he agrees with Leibniz about the plurality of substances, but he agrees with Spinoza that there is only one cause, and that cause is God. Now, man's knowledge of God and the world. Man does not have a clear and distinct ideas of God's attributes. God is way beyond human understanding. Even the idea of extension, although clear as such, cannot give him the idea of the infinity of God. So, man has a clear idea of the existence of the soul, but only confused ideas regarding its nature. So, meaning we have a clear idea that the soul exists, but as to how or what is the nature of the soul, we only have confused ideas or unclear ideas as to its nature. Man has a clear and distinct idea of the nature of the world, which consists in extension, but not a clear idea of its existence. Man does not know things directly, but he knows them only through the ideas which corresponds to them. And these ideas, as we have seen, or as I have said, are seen in the mind of God, the vision in God. Now, let's discuss his theory of occasionalism. It's a doctrine that tells us that all finite created entities are absolutely devoid of causal efficacy, meaning they cannot be the cause of anything. They cannot be a causal agent. At best, they are just the effects. And there's only one true causal agent. That is God. God is the only true causal agent. God is directly, immediately, and solely responsible for bringing about all the phenomena in the universe. God is the cause of everything. So he is not just the last or the final or the first cause. He is the only cause. So he cites an example. When a needle pricks the skin is physical. The physical event is merely an occasion for God to cause the appropriate mental state, like pain. So this tells us about the connection between mind and body. Something happened to the body, and then there is some kind of an effect to the mind in terms of pain. Okay? But it is not the body that caused the mental pain, but the body being pricked by a needle provides an occasion for God to cause the mental pain or the mental state. A volition in the soul to raise an arm, or for example, to think about something. So I raise my hand. Okay, that's a volition. I raise my hand. But it is something that occasions God to cause the arm to rise, or to have this idea present in my mind. Okay? So, volition and mental thinking or thought are occasions for God to cause something. Okay? So that's the mind-mind interaction or causality or occasion. The impact of one ball, say a billiard ball, upon another is another occasion for God to move the second ball. So it's not the first ball, the one that impacted the other ball, that causes the second ball to move. But rather, it was God who moved the second ball. The billiard balls only provided an occasion for God to move one object. So that's the body and body occasion. So in all three contexts, mind, body, mind, body, body, God's ubiquitous causal activity proceeds in accordance with certain general laws. Of course, except in the cases of miracles. That God only acts when the requisite material or psychic conditions obtain. If there are none, then God will not cause anything, or will not, there will be no occasion for him to cause anything. So God again is the only causal agent, and that the creatures, whether it is mind or body, spiritual or physical, merely are merely occasional causes. They only provide the occasion for God to perform or to act as causal agent. Now, there are of course some criticisms and some observations and comments. While it is claimed that occasionalism is an ad hoc solution to the mind-body problem, and the mind-body problem originated from the philosophy of Descartes, the dualism of Descartes, Malebranche and others base it from the general philosophical considerations of the nature of causal relations, from an analysis of the Cartesian concept of matter, and most importantly, from the theological premises about the essential ontological relationships between an omnipotent God and the created world that God sustains in existence. So that's one of the comments. And that Malebranche's argument on the absence of real causal powers in finite created substances, and that God is the sole causal agent, focuses on the motion of the bodies and the lack of necessary connection between them. The causal principle posits that in order for one thing, say for example A, to count as the cause of another thing, say B, there must be a necessary connection between the existence of A and the existence of B. A true cause is one such that the mind perceives a necessary connection between it and the effects, like a necessary connection between A and B. However, we cannot find such connection between any two physical events, or between any human mental events and a corresponding physical events. It is possible for one to will to raise his arm, but the arm will not raise it. I can think of raising my hand, but the arm will not rise. Or moving any part of the body, I can think of that, but that part of the body will not move. So if we examine our idea of all finite minds, we cannot see any necessary connection between their will and the motion of the body whatsoever. So the argument that God is the sole cause and there is a connection between God's will and the motion of bodies is based on God's omnipotence. So because God is the infinitely perfect being, we can see that there is such a necessary connection between the divine will and the motion of the bodies. It is therefore logically impossible that an omnipotent God wills a body to move, but the body does not move. Point of Malebranche that every time that this omnipotent God wills for something to happen, it will always happen. So there's the necessary connection between God as the sole agent or sole cause and the created beings as occasional causes. Malebranche's argument is also based on the impossibility that any finite mind or material body can have a power or efficiency to produce anything. A clear and distinct idea of body as extension represents the body as having only one property, which is a passive faculty of receiving various figures and various movements. So the body simply receives figures, movements from from something outside. So based on Descartes' conception of matter, a body does not have any active power. Because it is pure extension, it is essentially passive and inert. It is devoid of any motive force. And therefore the body cannot be, no, it cannot be the source or cause of any action. The body cannot act. The body cannot cause anything, whether on minds or on other bodies. So the body cannot be the causal agent. The idea of a soul does not involve the perception of any power to move the body or even to produce its own ideas. So, what we perceive through inner consciousness is an actual volition to move a body. For example, I will to raise my arm, and subsequently the arm rises, okay, or moves upward. But we do not perceive, either by inner consciousness or by reason, any power on the part of the soul to cause this motion. So the soul, for Malebranche, cannot be the cause of the motion of the body. Because we don't perceive any connection between willing a body part to move and the actual movement of the body part. Therefore, what we perceive is a general incompatibility between the idea of a created finite being having such a power or productive faculty. There's no such thing for Malebranche. Now, St. Thomas, during the scholastic period, earlier noted that the intention of occasionalists, like in the case of Malebranche, of course, St. Thomas predates Malebranche because he is a philosopher in the medieval ages. The intention of the occasionalists like Malebranche is to strengthen the assertion of God's omnipotence. However, he also noted that though God must concur with the creatures in producing effects, there is reason to conclude that the creatures are true secondary causes. It is more consistent with divine greatness to say that God communicates his power to creatures. Further, it is evident to the senses that creatures have the power to bring about effects. If there were no natures in creatures that would explain effects, then there could be no true scientific explanation of effects through their natural causes. So that is the take of St. Thomas about the idea of occasionalists, that it is just to strengthen the idea that God is omnipotent and that there is evidence that the senses have power to bring about effects. Now, what is the response of Malebranche for this? He said, God's greatness requires the communication of his power. And it is in fact idolatrous to attribute divine power to creatures. Because this power to move only belongs to God. It cannot be with the creatures. Next, that God alone can produce effects relies on the assumption that in a true cause, we can always perceive a necessary connection between the cause and its effect. But, according to Malebranche, there is no connection among bodily states, nor between bodily and mental states, nor among mental states. In all these cases, One can deny the connection without contradiction. Such a necessary causal connection is present only between the volitions of an omnipotent agent, God, and its objects. Therefore, the conclusion of Malebranche is that only such agent is God. God is the only true cause of all phenomena, whether it be physical to physical, or body to body, mind to mind, or mind to body. God is the only true cause. So, what are the essential points of this kind of occasionalism? It is an absolute contradiction that anything besides God should move a body. God's activity is required not only to create the world, but also to sustain its existence. That's why He will always be the only cause of the world. In God, there is no essential difference between creating and sustaining. The conservation of creatures is simply their continued creation. Now, this idea about conservation and continued creation is from an Augustinian tradition. And when God conserves and recreates a body, He must recreate it in some particular place and in some relation of distance to other bodies. He can make it rest or in motion in relation to some bodies. Now, let's go to his ethics. Because Malebranche reduced all causality to God, he's now confronted with the problem of the freedom of the will and the difficulty of moral evil or sin, which certainly cannot be attributed to God. So if God is the cause of everything, does it mean that God is the cause of evil and sin? God's causal activity does not eliminate freedom of the will in human beings. God is the direct source of an invincible inclination or natural motion in the soul towards good in general. So the soul, by natural motion, tends towards the good. Man always wills to be happy and necessarily loves what is clearly known and vividly felt to be good. But it is also in his power to allow or to refuse this general determination towards good, which is given by God. So man has the power to refuse. All minds love God by the necessity of their nature. But if they love anything else, it is by a free choice or by free choice of their will. So God is not the cause of this because it is done by man based on his free choice. So man sins when instead of directing the will through a clear and distinct perception of the supreme good to the love of God, allows himself to be directed away from God towards the pleasing but false goods presented to him by the senses. So it's the sense that tempts the will with false goods. That's why man sins and turns away from the good that comes from God. So moral evil is not an effect of a cause, but rather it is the suspension of the effect. Because God occasions this, God already perceived what would be the effect, But since man turns away, then the intended effect will not happen. Instead, a different effect, a moral evil, will happen. Okay? So this suspension is entirely due to man, who misuses his liberty by placing an impediment to the causality of God. So instead of this effect happening, the effect is suspended. The reason why man is capable of rendering the causality of God inefficacious, meaning he can, you know, he can ignore, he can suspend the causality of God, is due to the original sin, which placed this order between right reason and the passions, between the creature and God. Now, let's go to his theodicy about God. Malebranche's occasionalism takes on greater importance in the context of his theodicy, or justification of God's ways in the realms of nature and grace. He explains how God's omnipotence, his benevolence and perfection can be reconciled with the persistence of evil and the imperfections in the natural world. For example, there is always human suffering and sin in the world. And with the apparent unfairness and inefficiency in the distribution of divine grace and everlasting happiness. So how can there be an omnipotent, benevolent, perfect God if there is persistence of evil, there are imperfections in the world, human suffering, sin, unfairness, inefficacy, etc., etc. So that is a problem, no? A problem for God's omnipotence. Now, God is infinitely wise, good, powerful, and perfect. And yet, the world which God has created certainly appears to us to be quite imperfect. Imperfect in details, and there's always disorders of every variety. Now, the explanation to this problem is found in the consideration of the particular, the superficial, and obvious details of the universe, and of the means undertaken to achieve and sustain the whole, meaning the universe. Now, this is from his book, Nature and Grace. He said, Malebranche, in the order of nature, God acts for the most part through his general volition or will, which means that God does not execute with many particular volitions, that which can be executed by a few general volitions. So, meaning God does not act on particular events. So, he does not act every time that I say I'm going to raise my hand and my hand moves. I'm going to click this button, then something will happen there. So according to Malebranche, God does not do that. So he does not perform every time. So if there are millions of people clicking on the, or clicking on their tablets, so there are millions also of uh, causations from God. According to Malebranche, it does not happen that way. God acts for the most part through general volition or will. So he wills that every time anybody move or thinks of the hand to move, then it will move. Anytime that a billiard ball hits another ball, it will move. So God will not or does not perform or causes one particular ball to move every time one ball hits another ball. Okay? So he this is his general volition or will. Okay? So God looks not only to the final result of his creative act, that is to the goodness and perfection of the world per se, but also to his work or ways of operation. So the operation of God is in general. So he will He will command, for example, that every time a switch is on, then the light will be on. Right? So the world that God has created reconciles perfection of design with simplicity and generality of means of production and conservation. So he said, if God will act by particular volitions, that is, every time there is an action or volition, then he will move. No? That is, volitions that are ad hoc and not occasioned by some prior event in accordance with some law of nature, then God could correct deformities of birth, prevent physical disasters about to occur, and by a regular course of the laws of nature, and forestall sin and wickedness. But if God will do this, this would require that God performs constant miracles. He will always do something. Imagine there are billions of people, and many, let's suppose that 100 millions of people are clicking. So there will be 100 times that God will perform all these actions, all these particular volitions. But God does not act that way according to Malebranche. God acts only by general volitions. That is, volitions that are in accordance with some law and whose operation is occasioned by a prior event, as dictated by that law, in the most simple ways. So God can just command. Okay? Every time somebody presses this, this will be the effect. That's the general volition. So the activity or means most expressive of God's nature are of maximum simplicity, uniformity, fecundity, and universality. So God does not accomplish by complex means that which can be accomplished by simple means. That is within God's omnipotence. And God will not compromise the simplicity and the generality of his operations by some imperfections. So Malebranche insists that God's general will is operative not only in the order of nature, but also in the order of grace. A benevolent God wills by a simple volition that sinners convert and that all humans should be saved. That's the general will of God as far as grace is concerned. But not all humans are saved. Many are lost. And not all those who are saved appear to be worthy of salvation or ready to receive the grace. The distribution of grace is governed by certain general laws willed by God. The occasional causes responsible for the actual distribution of grace in accordance with those laws are the thoughts and desires in the human soul of Jesus Christ. So that ends my presentation of the philosophy of Malebranche. Thank you very much for listening.